Good morning, Mrs. Standridge. I'm here today. We're going to be reading Elijah of Buxton. We're going to be reading chapter 7. Let's find out what Elijah's up to today. Mr. Leroy shows how to really make a lesson stick. The clouds got to be always on, and they ended up blacking out the moon 2 nights later. Since it's dangerous to work with an axe when there ain't no light, Leroy figured he had to lay off his work early. It ain't our usual custom. Most nights he kept on working till long after I was home and sleeping, but this night we started walking together out of Mrs. Holton's field. I don't work nowhere near as hard as Mr. Leroy, but that don't matter. I was good and tuckered out. Betwixt schooling and studying and choring round the settlement and working till past dark with him for most of the last couple of weeks, I'll own up that I was lagging that night, and my mind might not have been quite right. That ain't to make no excuses about what happened, it's just telling the truth. Most times me and Mr. Leroy don't say much whilst we work, not only 'cause it's hard to talk to someone that's knocking away at trees and swinging a heavy axe, but also 'cause Mr. Leroy don't seem partial to running his mouth nohow. To my way of thinking, that meant us walking home together was a good time to get a whole lot of the conversation out on. Most every other night I gotta walk home by myself, and I ain't complaining, but sometimes it does seem like the walking would be a lot easier if I had someone to do it with. It ain't no sign of being a fragile boy, but if you have to walk home on a night where the moon's got blacked out, you just might get surprised and find yourself jumping at noises coming from the side of the road or from out the woods and then running all the way home screaming. Anybody that has some sense would be a little afeared that one of those bears or snakes or wolves might have wandered out of their regular area and come over here. So maybe twixt the being real tired from all my work and the being real happy about having some company, my mind didn't have no chance at being right that night when the moon was covered and Mr. Leroy and me walked home together. Since he weren't much of a talker, I figured he had plenty of practice on being a listener, and I was jawing at him pretty regular and fast. Even though it happened 2 whole days ago, I was still mighty worked up about Mr. Travis near snatching Cooter's ear off and not teaching us about family breeding contests. So after I talked for a while about fishing and animals in the woods and Ma's scratchy sweaters and how many first place ribbons Champion and Jingle Boy got at the fair, I started in on what happened when I got all those lines forced on me. Whilst we were walking a mile or so, Mr. Leroy would grunt and nod his head every once in a while, like he was paying some mind to what I was saying. But by the time about Mr. Travis, we'd covered us 2 miles easy, and Mr. Leroy weren't showing no kind of interest in nothing I was having to say. He just tromped on ahead, looking like he was wishing I'd be quiet. But like I already owned up to, lots of things were coming together to make me want to talk and not pay too much mind to who it was I was talking to. I said, "And Mr. Travis went berserk, and afore you can blink he jumps clean across the room, and I can't say how he did it, because to get at Cooter Bixby he had to go over 3 rows of children, and didn't one of them desks get knocked aside nor toppled over, nor didn't one of them children have on 'em nor bruises from where he must have stepped." I could tell Mr. Leroy didn't particular want to hear all this. He didn't tell me to be still, but he did pick up the pace of his was rushing to get home. I weren't about to miss the chance to get this off my chest, so I started halfway running and halfway walking to keep up with him. I told him, "So Mr. Travis has got Cooter's ear wound up so tight that it's starting to look like somebody's finger instead of somebody's ear, and it's about the most awful thing you ever seen in all your days." Then I said 'em. I said those words that made it so the lesson about familiarity and contempt will be fixed in my mind for so long as I live, even if that's to 50. I said, "And me and all them other little I knowed better. Ma and Pa didn't tolerate no one saying that word round 'em. They say it's a sign of hatred when a white person says it, and a sign of bad upbringing and ignorance when one of our own calls it out. So there ain't no good excuses. I knowed better. I didn't think Mr. Leroy was paying me no mind. I didn't even get the chance to get the whole word out. I never even saw it coming. It felt like whatever rope it was that was holding up the moon gave out all of a sudden, and the moon slipped free and busted through the clouds and came crashing down to earth before it exploded square on top of me. All I saw at first was a bright light, which I figured Mr. Leroy backhanding me across my mouth. Then I felt my senses. It must have been me falling. Then I felt like I'd been chunked by the moon, which would have been me knocking my head against the ground. I don't think I was out for more than a second, but when I came to, I wished I'd been out for a whole lot longer, 'cause Mr. Leroy was standing over top of me with his hand drawed back, fixing to crack me all over again. He made up for all the not talking he'd been doing whilst we walked. Now he commenced jawing at me just as hard as I'd been jawing at him. He shouted, "Is you out of your mind?" I was about to say, "No, sir," but I figured this was one of them questions people ask just for the sake of asking it. They don't really want no answer. I probably couldn't have said nothing no way. My tongue was too busy roaming round my mouth, checking to see if any of my teeth had got set loose by Mr. Leroy's slap. He said, "What you think they call me whilst they was doing this?" He opened the front of his shirt and showed me where a big square with a letter T in the middle of it was. The scar was raised up and shining to see, even if there weren't no moonlight at all. "What you think they call me?" Mr. Leroy, it was him that lost his mind. "What you think they call my girl when they sold her? What kind of baby they call her from up on the block?" Mr. Leroy was spitting and looking mad as a hatter. I sure was glad he'd gone and dropped his axe when he'd first busted me across the mouth. I said, "Mr. Leroy, sir, I'm sorry. What name you think they call my wife when they take her to another man for his own? What?" "I'm sorry, sir, I'm sorry. How you gonna call them children in that school and yourself that name them white folks down home calls us? Has you lost your natural mind? You wants to be like one of them? You wants to be keeping they hate alive?" I saw that Mr. Leroy really was out of his mind. He must have thought I was a white person that said that word. I begged him, "Mr. Leroy, sir, please, I ain't white. Please don't hit me no more." He raised his left hand, and I closed my eyes and tried to mash myself down into the dirt. He said, "White person? You thinking this here's about some white person? Look at this, look." I opened my eyes and saw he weren't going to slap me again. He was showing me where his littlest finger on his left hand used to be. He was pointing at all that was left there, a little stump. He said, "Who you think it was cut my finger off? Who?" I didn't know if I should answer him or just keep quiet and let him have his say. I shrugged my shoulders. He said, "A slave, that's who. And the whole time he's slashing and stabbing at me trying to cut my throat. What name he calling me? What name?" I said, "I know, sir, but I ain't going to say it no more." He said, "You thinks just 'cause that word come out from twixt your black lips it mean anything different? You think it ain't choke up with the same kind of hate and disrespect it has when they say it? You can't see it be even worse when you call it out?" I told him, "Sir, I only said it 'cause I hear lots of children say it." "What difference it make who you hear say it? I can understand a little if one of y'all freeborn use it. Y'all's ignorant in a whole slew of ways. Y'all ain't been told your whole life that's what you is. But someone what was a slave, or someone whose ma and pa was a slave and raised them good like yourn done, that just shows you believing that what we be. That just shows you done swallowed they poison, and swallowed it whole." There warn't going to be no more hitting. I could tell Mr. Leroy was calming down. He commenced rubbing on his left arm, then reached his hand down to help me up. Once I got up, I quick wiped away the tears that were trying to get in my eyes. It ain't being fragile, But don't nothing in the world make you want to bawl more than getting a good backhand slap when you ain't expecting it. Mr. Leroy said, "Now belting you like that probably warn't the right thing to do, Elijah, but I ain't sorry I done it. If my boy Ezekiel was to call someone out they name like that, I praise to God someone would bust him up too. Y'all young folks gotta understand that's a name what ain't never called with nothing but hate. That ain't nothing but a word them slavers done chained us with. And if God's just, like I know he is, one day it gonna be buried right along with the last one of them. That ain't one of the things we need to be carrying to Canada with us. Now, if you and me's gonna do any more working together, you know what you gotta say." I did. I told him, "I'm sorry, Mr. Leroy, I ain't never gonna use that word again." He said, "You got to always keep in mind, Elijah, that I'm grown and you ain't. You got to always remember that we gets along just fine, but I ain't your friend. I cares about you like you's my own boy, but you always got to give me my respect. You saying that word ain't showing no respect for me. It ain't showing no respect for your folks. It ain't showing no respect for yourself. And it ain't showing no respect for no one what's had that word spit on them whilst they's getting beat on like an animal." Mr. Leroy used his hat to brush the back of my shirt and pants off and reached his hand out for me to shake it, then said, "Elijah, it's my hope that there ain't no hard feelings twixt you and me. I likes the way you owned up to what you done." I shook his hand and said, "No, sir, ain't no hard feelings at all." Some of the time, when a grown person asks you a question, you're smart to tell them what it is they want to hear, but that warn't what I was doing. I said there weren't no hard feelings 'cause I meant it. Pa's always telling me that people that used to be slaves are toting things around with them that can't be seen with your regular eyes. He says once someone was a slave, there's always going to be something in 'em that knows parts about life that freeborn folks can't never know, mostly horrific parts. He tells me that's why I got to be sharp on my guard when I'm talking with anyone that got free. They've seen people acting in ways that can't help but leave scars and peculiarities. Things that I might not think mean nothing, but things that can cut 'em to the quick. So I weren't doing nothing but telling Mr. Leroy the truth when I told him I weren't holding no grudges and that I weren't going to use that word again. He said, "Good, son, 'cause I really want you to know what I'm trying to say, and sometimes I ain't too good with my words." I said, "I know what you're trying to say, Mr. Leroy. It boils down to familiarity breeds contempt." Mr. Leroy picked up his axe and swung it across his left shoulder, then put his right hand on my head. I'll always remember Mr. Leroy's hand on my head and the words he told me. I'll always remember that night when there warn't no moon and me and Mr. Leroy walked home together. Wow, so Elijah learned a very powerful lesson there. When we talk about how we learn lessons, how do you think is the best way to learn lessons? Do you learn them best by someone telling you, or do you learn it best by living it and experiencing it for yourself? Well, think about that. We'll read chapter 8 tomorrow, and I hope to see you then. Bye.